This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In some episodes of this series, I look at the worst cards in a particular category, and that's what we're doing today with a look at the worst 6-mana cards in Magic. This continues an ongoing theme in my MTG Top 10s, where I've looked at the worst cards at each mana value, starting at 1. 6 mana is a lot, so you should usually expect to receive something fairly significant when you put forth such a big investment. Basically, you should be getting a card that has a very significant impact on the board, but that isn't true of all 6-mana cards. As you'll see, the ones that made this list will actively hurt your chances of winning the game when you cast them. This is because they are at best woefully inefficient, and at worst they hurt you more than they help you. While the cards that appear on this list and the order in which they appear is up to me in the end, there are some requirements for a card to show up on this list at all. It has to be bad in Magic's 3 main play modes. This includes 60-card constructed formats, EDH, and limited. The card also has to have been bad for its entire existence. This keeps cards from showing up on the list that were actually playable in their original context. In other words, for a card to be on one of these worst lists, it has to be bad everywhere and throughout all of Magic's history. Alright, let's dive in with my picks for the 10 worst 6-mana cards in Magic. At number 10, I've got Ivory Guardians. A 6-mana 3/3 is a horrendous rate, and while this card does offer upside, it's fairly narrow and underpowered. It has protection from red, and gets +1/+1 if your opponent controls a red permanent. So yeah, the idea here is that this is supposed to hose red decks, and you could side it in against them, but it's pretty awful at doing what it was actually designed to do because it's so overcosted. It doesn't help either that red decks tend to be pretty fast, so a 6-mana card that hates on red isn't exactly going to do much to stop them. Ivory Guardians has a terrible floor as a 6-mana 3/3 against non-red decks, and its absolute ceiling is a 6-mana 4/4 that has relevant protection. I'm not interested in playing either of those cards. At number 9, it is Grothskither. This is another creature with absolutely horrible base stats and a really weak text box. Grothskither lets you return one of your other Grothskithers from your graveyard to your hand, but only when it gets blocked. Obviously, this card is at a huge disadvantage in a singleton format like EDH, but it's terrible in non-singleton formats too. This is just an incredibly weak payoff for playing multiples of this horrible 6-mana 3/3 in your deck. I guess the idea is that if you have one in your graveyard and your opponent blocks this with their X3, you get a 2-for-1, but a lot of things have to line up right for that to ever be a possibility. For one thing, your opponent will just never block when this would result in a trade, and it isn't like that will be hard for them since you're in the later stages of the game. That also means the board will usually have multiple creatures that are much larger than Grothskither and can block, kill it, and survive. You also have to have another Grothskither in your graveyard, which is far from a guarantee too. This card would be much better if it took a page from a lot of the other mediocre collect-em-all type cards that are at least playable in limited, which let you search your library for another copy of the card, instead of requiring you to have one in your graveyard and requiring your opponent to block it to get the value in the first place. In reality, Grothskither plays like a 6-mana 3/3 with no upside at all, and that's a horrible card. At number 8, it is Boglums. I think a 6-mana 4/1 is even worse than the 6-mana 3/3s we've seen so far, and the Hoodlums text box isn't even all upside. The upside it does have is that it clashes when it enters the battlefield, which means you and your opponent both reveal the top card of your libraries, and whomever has the higher mana value wins the clash. If you manage to win that clash, the Hoodlums enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So yeah, even if you manage to make everything go perfectly, which is by no means a guarantee, the ceiling of this card is that it is a 6-mana 5/2 that can't block. When a card has high power and low toughness like this, one of the things it can do is block and kill a lot of things. But that's not so with the Hoodlums, who pretty much only have the option of attacking, and when they do, they can just be blocked by a 1/1 if you lost the clash, and a 2/2 if you won. While that might be an even trade, the massive difference in mana spent on the cards that traded results in a huge tempo hit. They really should have given this haste or something, so that it can at least come down out of nowhere and hit the opponent hard once. As it is, the Hoodlums will basically never have a successful attack, and because it can't block either, it's a pretty useless card. At number 7, I have Dripping Dead, which is fairly similar to Bog Hoodlums. Both are 6-mana 4/1s that can't block, but I think Dripping Dead has even more insignificant upside. This is because it will never enter as a 5/2, and the ability it does have basically never matters. When it does combat damage to a creature, that creature gets destroyed. Those words sound pretty powerful, I guess, but it's actually a worse version of Death Touch. Death Touch kills things if they get damaged in any way, and this only counts combat damage, and because this can't block, that means it can only do combat damage when it attacks, severely limiting how useful that ability can be. What's more is it dies when it gets blocked by anything at all, so it's far from a guarantee that it will ever take down anything impressive, since a 1/1 can block and kill this. The coolest thing you can do with this is give it some sort of lure effect, but that's significant setup to make an otherwise horrible card actually do something. But hey, at least Dripping Dead has some pretty awesome art. At number 6, it is Celestial Sword. Before equipment made its debut in 2004, they tried several designs to give cards an equipment-like flavor, and this is one of those. But boy, is it awful. Usually, when you pay 6 for this, it doesn't do anything until your next turn. That's already a massive liability, but then the bonus that it offers costs 3 more mana to use. That means you spend 9 mana before this does anything. Then, the thing it does isn't even that good. +3/+3 is a pretty big boost to be able to use repeatedly, but the fact it makes you sacrifice the creature at the beginning of the next instep really negates that upside for the most part. At number 5, it is Jandors Ring. When this 6-mana artifact is in play, you can pay 2 generic and tap it to discard the last card you drew that turn and draw a card. If you're not used to looking at older cards, you might be thinking you don't have to tap this to use its ability, but because this is a mono artifact, that means you can only use it once every turn, and all cards that used to have this mono artifact type are now just regular artifacts that tap to use their ability. Anyway, in short, this allows for a very narrow form of what is usually referred to as rummaging, in reference to Rummaging Goblin, that is, discarding a card and then drawing a card. You can see just how bad this card is, because if you upgrade the effect, it still isn't good. So, for example, if you had to pay a total of 8 mana to rummage the regular way, it wouldn't be very good. Most rummage effects let you choose any card to discard before drawing another card, and that's not the case here, so it's a worse version of rummage. And on many turns, you'll have no interest in using this, and when you do want to use it, it isn't exactly going to feel like a good deal. Even if this drew you a card for 2 mana, it wouldn't be that good. And this really narrow form of rummaging is way worse than drawing a card. Basically, you can make this card a couple of notches better, and we're still talking about something that's awful. At number 4, it is Zephyrs Spirit. This is a 6-mana 0/6. That is a horrible starting point, and its text box is largely downside. Anytime it blocks, it gets returned to your hand. Blocking is basically all this card can do thanks to its 0 power, and it isn't even good at it. Sure, it will never die in combat because it always bounces, but you'd much rather have a 6-mana 0/6 that just stays in play. That's far more upside than this nonsense ability is. Believe it or not, though, I think there are 3 6-mana cards that are even worse than Zephyrs Spirit. Like our number 3 card, Racolite. This is a 6-mana artifact that also expects you to pay extra mana for a very minor effect, like Jandors Ring. In this case, you pay 2 mana to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to any target. If the card ended there, it would be very bad. However, it gets even worse. If you use that ability, it returns to your hand at the beginning of the next instep. So, if you want to keep preventing the damage, you're going to have to be spending 6 mana to cast this every turn, meaning you'll always have less mana to use this already unimpressive ability. At number 2, it is Pyramids, another 6-mana artifact that has an activated ability that costs 2 mana, but I think this one is even more useless than Jandors Ring or Racolite. When Pyramids is in play, you can pay 2 generic mana to destroy an aura attached to a land or prevent a land from being destroyed. Both of those are very narrow uses and certainly not something you want your 6-mana card to be doing. Sure, people blow up lands sometimes, and this can really help you in that situation, unless, of course, they cast it the turn after you spent 6 mana on this, in which case you're not going to be able to save very many lands. Auras with Enchant Land aren't exactly commonplace either, so neither of this expensive artifacts modes are going to come up in most games. And at number 1, it is Acen Highway. This 6-mana enchantment gives all white creatures Planeswalk. That does mean the Highway actually does something, and if you happen to be playing against someone who has a Plains in play, making all of your creatures unblockable could be pretty spicy. Though, honestly, 6 mana for that sort of conditional unblockability is pretty bad. But what really makes this the worst 6-mana card of them all is the fact that it's symmetrical. If you're casting this, guess what? You probably have Plains lying around, and if this actually does something, well, it means your opponent has some Plains in play, which also probably means they have some white creatures, which will gain Planeswalk. I'm not really sure what they were thinking when they designed this. If they had made it asymmetrical, it wouldn't actively hurt your chances of winning. At least cards like Pyramids, Racolite, and Jandors Ring have effects that are upside, even if they are incredibly narrow and inefficient. In this case, we're talking about something that is both incredibly inefficient and has a massive downside. That makes it the worst 6-mana card in all of Magic. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst 6-mana cards in the game. If you want to own any of these cards, because maybe you want to try to prove me wrong, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for every card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.